So naturally, I forgot, because it's been a while, to click the Go Live button in StreamYard. So I will probably have to stream the first part of the class to YouTube again. Okay, so let's have a look at our board here. So I'm not going to go over everything, but I just sort of want to highlight a lot of the some of the most important comments that are here. Give a few notes of my own, and then we can open up Visual Studio and start to play around a little bit. So some of the most important things, I think this one right here in the first column, whose note was this? John, was this you? I thought maybe this was you. The one that says faster performance, code gets optimized. That's one of the huge advantages. So ASP.NET was really the first technology, one of the first technologies that allowed compiled web code. Before that, all web code was like PHP. It was interpreted. So the code didn't get compiled. It ran more slowly and was less secure. So this is one of the big benefits of ASP.NET. Yeah, it's platform independent. Justine, absolutely. We can use it for a lot of different things. It's easy to configure and maintain our .NET applications, absolutely. And Andre, you're right, it is largely language independent, although primarily C# is the language. And because you guys have already done a course in C#, that's going to make it that much easier. There's no new language for you to learn as we dive into our course. So MVC is really, it's not unique to ASP.NET. It's really a pattern, a way of structuring our applications. Okay. So MVC does stand for Model View Controller, as Sky, Master of the Universe, mentioned. And what do these things mean? I mean, one of the big takeaways from today is what is a model, what is a view, and what is a controller? And as Nick has kind of laid out in this sticky here, the model really, that really works with our database. So if we have 10 tables in our database, we're going to have 10 model files in our application. The views are our presentation or our user interface layer. So if we're building a web app, those are going to be HTML files. And then the controller is that level, that logic layer that sits in between, that kind of takes requests in from the view, speaks to the database, and sends info back. And we'll look at the mechanics of how that works in Visual Studio today. So a lot of value, a lot of reasons we use this pattern. So we don't only see it in .NET, we see it in Java. There's MVC frameworks in PHP, for example, things like Laravel that I know someone, I think it was Alex, said he worked with on co-op. So it allows us to do different things, right? It promotes code reuse. As Mitch mentioned, it allows us to easily divide the work because we have many, many files, but they're smaller files. And each file has one specific purpose. So we talk about separation of concerns, meaning files that work with the database, they don't do anything else. There's no code in there for user interface if that file is working with the database. It allows us to group things together logically. And yeah, absolutely, as Parth said, it promotes code reuse as well. So a lot of developers, once they go to using MVC, they tend to use it for everything. And Rails, Ruby on Rails, that was really the first really popular web framework to use this MVC pattern. So we're going to be using kind of a newer version of ASP.NET, moving into the fourth column here, group 4. So we're using a version of ASP.NET called .NET Core. So .NET Core is newer. It's been around since 2016. It's platform independent, unlike the original version of the .NET framework. And as Brody mentioned, I think Adam mentioned as well, .NET Framework can be used for desktop applications in Windows. We can't use Core for those things, but Core is much more lightweight. It's also much faster. So that's something nobody mentioned. But the performance of .NET Core apps is generally much higher. So this is the direction that Microsoft is moving in. We're sort of moving away from the traditional .NET framework and moving more towards focusing on .NET Core. In terms of integration, ASP.NET integrates really well with Microsoft products. So SQL Server, so Microsoft's enterprise level database program, many hosts will rent you space on using ASP.NET. It works with Microsoft's Entity Framework, Data Access Library, integrated with Microsoft support, and as Leo also mentioned, Azure, so Microsoft's cloud hosting service, which we're going to use this semester. So you guys got some really great content here. So I'm going to leave the board up. And as I said, a lot of the questions that kind of come out of our review quiz next week are going to come out of the things that are here on this board. Okay, so I'll keep it up for you guys as a reference. Okay, so just wanted to give sort of fill in some of the other pieces about .NET. These slides are up in the week 1 folder on D2L. So ASP.NET's kind of it's a mature product. I remember when Microsoft came out with it in 2002, I purchased the first version of Visual Studio.NET for the low price of $1,700 US for the professional version. And this was based on Microsoft's kind of a legacy technology. You still even see files with the extension .asp. So originally when Microsoft had dynamic web pages with server-side scripting, they used VBScript, much the same way we did with PHP, and that code was interpreted. And the idea when they came up with the .NET framework in the early 2000s was they wanted to offer developers a way to compile their web code so it would run faster and be more secure. It also allowed developers to write object-oriented code, unlike in traditional scripting language like VBScript or PHP. PHP now supports object-oriented principles, but that was really an add-on. It wasn't baked into PHP. This compiled code also allowed us to be able to write a single code base and then deploy an application with a web front end that could run in a browser, or a Windows Forms, a desktop front end, and we could keep that same back end code. In 2008, Microsoft adopted the MVC pattern. So that hasn't been baked into .NET from the beginning, but that's been around now for the last 12 years. So that's also quite mature. And then 2016, .NET Core, which was really focused on open source cross-platform development for the web, for API development, and really designed to be high performance and lightweight. So primarily we see .NET being used. I mean, it's suitable for anything, but we especially see it in large scale applications, in large organizations. So for example, most web development projects done by the government of Canada, they're using the ASP.NET development stack. So not only is there benefits in terms of the end user, but there's also a lot of reasons as developers to consider using .NET for building web applications. It's actually my favorite, my personal choice. If I'm going to build a web application, most times I'm going to use ASP.NET for it. That our code is compiled, it's more secure, it runs fast. These are all great reasons to use it. We're developing in Visual Studio, which is sort of the Cadillac of IDEs when it comes to web development. Has more features, more tools than most other development. One of the other great things about developing in ASP.NET is that a lot of things are automated. So repetitive tasks like building login screens, for example, adding jQuery and Bootstrap into projects, all these things are kind of baked right into Visual Studio. We can turn them on or turn them off as we want, but we're doing a lot less building of everything from scratch. Visual Studio gives us lots of templates to get us started and save us time and automate regular tasks. We've got the benefits of MVC that we discussed earlier, and then we've got the integration, things like SQL Server, Azure, even GitHub, which is also owned by Microsoft now. So .NET Core also supports other things. People mentioned the speed of development, the ability to make our applications portable and scalable, absolutely are benefits. We'll also talk later on about dependency injection and how we can at runtime decide when an object depends on another object, we can supply that object. We'll talk about that little more advanced topic a bit later on in the course. And maintainability, again, something that many of you mentioned in our brainstorming board. So what does Visual Studio kind of offer us as web developers? One of the first things that it offers, and Visual Studio was really the first to give this to web developers, was runtime debugging. So we could load a web page and we could put a breakpoint in our code and we can walk through the server-side code in real time as our application loads, which is something that most web application tools don't allow us to do. So incredibly helpful for debugging, seeing, being able to see value of variables at runtime, being able to see exactly what's happening in our server-side script. We've got lots of project templates. So when we create a new project, we can specify, are we creating an MVC web application? Are we building an API with no front end? Do we want a back-end .NET application with an Angular or React single page user interface template? So it comes with all these things out of the box. When we create one of these web projects with MVC, we're going to get all these things included. It's going to give us a starter page that includes a shared header, footer. It's going to include Bootstrap and jQuery. That's going to be mobile responsive right out of the box without us writing any code at all. It also has libraries for doing authentication and authorization. So we don't have to build our own registration login pages. We don't have to write our own code to hash passwords. All these things are available in a library we can just plug in and use. Visual Studio also has a package manager. Yep, Nick, the PowerPoint should actually be, sorry, it is on D2L. I may have just need to make it visible. Thank you. Yes, it's there. If you just refresh the week 1 folder, it's the third item, lesson 1 slides. Just turn a couple of these items on. So NuGet is a package manager. This is for downloading additional code libraries. So let's say we want to do something like add a Twitter feed to our .NET application. We could go and search for a package that will install a library so we can just use that library rather than writing the code. It allows us to do unit testing, which we're going to do later on in the course, and also integrates really well with version control systems, particularly Git and GitHub. So we'll kind of do a bit of a quick tour today. We'll try and wrap up by 4 o'clock today. So I want to look just a little more carefully and talk about exactly how MVC works. So I've enabled this diagram as well in the week 1 folder. So here's what it looks like in an ASP.NET application. We've got a client, user in any browser, doesn't matter what kind of device they're on, and they make a request. Most of our URLs are descriptive in ASP.NET. So they make a request to some domain, and then the rest of the URL looks like this: orders/details/1000. So this is a pretty descriptive, that URL is pretty descriptive of exactly what should happen. So the user clicks a link or types in that address, and the server, there's a dispatcher which interprets that URL. And the first thing it does is the first word after the domain, that tells the server which controller is going to handle this request. So if the the URL starts with orders, it means there's going to be a file in here in the folder called controllers. We're going to have a file called orders controller. And inside of this controller, we're going to have a method or an action with this name of details. And the last part of the URL is going to be a parameter value. So this details method is going to expect an integer value to be passed in. So the controller details method takes in this request. The client is asking for this URL. So what the details method is then going to do is go and use a file called models order, and this will be singular. And this controller is going to request the model to go into the database and write a query using our primary key value of 1,000. So the model is going to talk to our database, and the database is going to hand back some data, strongly typed object, an order object that matches the requested parameter value. So now the controller has instantiated and populated an instance of an order. So then the controller is going to load a view, and it's going to look for this file. It's going to be in views, orders, details, and it's going to have this extension, which we haven't seen before, this CS HTML. All our views will have this extension in ASP.NET. And it's also going to pass it order 1000 so that those details can be rendered to the user. So the views are just our HTML. The models are our business classes. They kind of map to tables in our database. And then the controller is the logic file. So if we have a customers table, we'll have a separate customers model, customers controller, and set of customer views. If we have a products table, we'll have a product model, product controller that handles all the logic, and then the individual product views. So we have lots of files, but each file serves only one purpose. It's either rendering or collecting data from a user, handling all the logic, or interfacing with the database. So this allows us to separate out the different pieces of our application. Our presentation, our logic, and our model are separate. It means it's easy for us to divide up the work among a team. Our code is organized and modular. So if we have an issue with something to do with an order, we don't have to look through all the customer files. We can reuse our code across applications. It also makes finding and fixing errors easier, because we don't have to look through. If we're having a database error, we can ignore all the view files. If you think about what our PHP pages look like, if I open up, let's say, one of our PHP files from last semester. Let's see, if I just open up one of those quickly. So for example, here was our list of artists. So on this page, we've got some HTML presentation. Then we've got some database code, an SQL query, some logic to build the query, fetch the results. And then we're kind of looping through with a bunch of logic here. So our database code, our logic, and our HTML presentations all in a single file. That means dividing the work, but also debugging when things go wrong is much more difficult because all this code is jammed together. For this same process, in an MVC, we have separate files. So if we have a database error, we're going to look at the model. We don't need to look here in the views. I think I left a couple extra. Well, that slide can come out. You can ignore that one. So some of the files, some of the important files we're going to see, we're going to set up a project in a minute. So some files that are going to be, we're going to have in all of our projects. We've got a startup.cs file. So this is to configure the application in code. So we can basically say what components are enabled, which ones are not, and any settings involved that those components need. We have a file called appsettings.json. So this is for global settings, things like our database connections. If we've got API keys, they all get stored globally in this JSON array. And then inside of views, we have a shared folder, and we get this file called _layout.cshtml. This is a default template. So it's going to give us a navigation bar. It gives us links to Bootstrap and jQuery and a header and footer. And obviously we can customize it. We can get rid of this template, but it's a starting point. So we don't have to build our UI completely from scratch. And also the other thing that we're going to see is the syntax within our HTML. So here's a little code snippet. You can see a few kind of non-standard HTML things here. So Microsoft's view syntax is called Razor. The files have a CSHTML extension. And wherever we've got server-side code, rather than having an opening and closing tag like we did in PHP, we just prefix our server-side code with a @ symbol, and Visual Studio will highlight it in yellow. So that makes it very obvious when we're looking at one of our views where the server-side code is. So we'll see some extra tags here like this ASP action. And here we're rendering out some server-side values using the @ symbol. So what I want to do is I'd like to open up Visual Studio and let's just create kind of an empty project. Won't be totally empty, but a base project. And we'll explore a little bit how it works, how it's structured, and what Visual Studio gives us. We probably won't work with this project in future weeks. We'll make a new one probably next week, but let's fire up Visual Studio and we'll just walk through the process of making a new project. And we can try making a few changes to it. So in Visual Studio, one other thing I should point out is you do need, it doesn't come built in with Visual Studio, is you do need the .NET Core SDK. And I did include the link to install the SDK in my introductory email. It's not very large, but if you didn't install it, you'll want to go back to the email that I sent out last week. Just going to confirm this is the correct URL, or you can just go to .net.microsoft.com. And if you click the download link here, so the URL is just /download. We want to install the latest version of the .NET Core Software Development Kit. So that would be this link right here. So again, most of you probably have this already. But this link under .NET Core 3.1, it's not the .NET framework we want. We want .NET Core. And we want to download the .NET Core SDK. And I believe Visual Studio has to be closed. It's not a really big file. So if you don't have it, you can go ahead and download it and install it first. Many of you probably have it already because it was in the instructions I sent out last week. So again, you can see the URL in my browser. Just go to .net.microsoft.com/download. And beside this build apps, the second button here that says download .NET Core SDK. We'll want to install that. So once we've done that, I'm going to go to I'm going to open up Visual Studio. I'm using 2019, and I'm going to click on New Project. So what we're going to use in this course is this template here that says ASP.NET Core Web Application. So I'm going to click on that. And then I'm going to click the next button. And once I click next, I'm going to get prompted with some options as to what type of web application we want to create. You can actually see in the description that's highlighted in gray, we can create web apps with Razor pages, MVC, or single page apps with Angular, React, or Redux. We are going to want to use MVC. I'm going to click next. For now, I'll just call it web application 1. It doesn't really matter. I'm going to leave these defaults. And I'm going to click Create. And then it will give me a couple of other options. So it defaults to me. So it asks me if I want .NET Core or .NET Framework. So I'm always going to use .NET Core in this class. And I'll just use the latest version of the SDK. If you don't have version 3.1 right now, but you have version 2, that's fine. You'll want to install version 3 before next week. But if you create it with an earlier version of .NET Core for today, not a problem. I'm going to pick the Web Application Model View Controller template. So this is a project template for using ASP.NET Core MVC views and controllers, or for building HTTP services. I'm going to check off Configure HTTPS. All our web applications should use HTTPS, as any of our public websites should use an SSL encryption certificate. The other thing I'm going to change up here under authentication, you can see it defaults to saying no authentication. I'm going to change this. And I've got a bunch of options for the different types of authentication. I'm going to pick individual user accounts, and that defaults to store user accounts in app, which is what I'm going to keep, meaning store the user accounts in our database. We're not going to use a database for today, but normally we're going to want to pick this option when we build our semester-long project, as well as when you build your assignments. You're going to want to use a database, so you'll want to change the authentication to individual user accounts, and you'll leave this option as store user accounts in app. What we pick for today doesn't really matter. We're not really going to keep this project. And then I'll click OK. And lastly, I'll click Create. One of the other neat things that Visual Studio offers, so let's see what's in here. Notice we've got this option to add to source control. We can maybe look at that later. So that's our GitHub integration. So when I go over to my Solution Explorer, this sort of shows me my project tree. If you don't see this window, you can always turn it on through the View menu. It's the very first option is View Solution Explorer. So here's what our project template looks like. We've got some dependencies. So we're using .NET Core as our framework. And for packages, because we said we chose security, it already added a couple of security packages from Microsoft or ASP.NET Core known as Identity. So we've got an Identity UI, so this will build register and login pages for us. And then the Entity Framework, this is so that we can do authentication and talk to our database. We've got a www root folder. This contains the static assets for our project. So we already have a default favicon, which we can replace. We have a simple CSS file, which we can change. We have a base JS file, which should be empty, where we can write any custom client-side JavaScript. And then inside the lib folder, we've already got Bootstrap, jQuery, and jQuery validation enabled. We don't have to use any of these things, but they're all here for us. The areas folder, we'll come back to that. And then we've got controllers. So let's take a look at what does one of these logic files look like. We already have a file called the home controller. So what does this look like? So it inherits from the parent, the base controller class. We've got a constructor. And then we've got three methods: index, privacy, and error. And each one of these returns or loads a view. Data we're not going to work with today. We'll deal with that. Nothing in models really. And then our views, our individual pages are here. So under home, we have an index view, which has a bit of server-side code, which we can see the yellow highlighting and the @ symbol, and then just some standard HTML. Notice there's no head body tags. Here's our privacy page, just some different content. And then inside of shared, we've got an underscore layout file. So this is our site template. So it includes metadata, links to Bootstrap, as well as a mobile responsive Bootstrap navigation bar with two links, one to home, one to privacy. And in the middle, we have this render body statement. So this is where the individual page content gets injected. And we can make changes. We'll play around and modify some of the things in this template. Here's our app settings.json file. So it already has a default database connection just to a local database file. We'll update that in a few weeks. And here's our startup file. So it configures our database. So the default is use SQL Server for our database. Again, we can change it. We can set whether the environment is development or not, whether we're using HTTPS, whether we're using authentication and authorization. And then we can also see the default path of how URLs are mapped. So I mentioned that the default URL mapping is controller, method, and parameter. So that's laid out automatically here in this use endpoints, that this is our pattern, the controller name, and then also what the default is. So if no controller specified, we'll use the home controller's index method. And the last value is an optional parameter. One of the other things Visual Studio includes is we have a built-in web server. So when we were developing with PHP, in order to run our pages locally, we had to install a local server, WAMP, XAMPP, or MAMP, which caused lots of people grief in getting those installed and configured. In Visual Studio, it comes with a built-in web server called IIS Express. IIS is Microsoft's production level web server, but Visual Studio includes it. So if we actually want to launch our site and get it running in the browser to see what this site template looks like, if I go to the debug menu, I'm going to choose start without debugging. I'll show you the difference. You can use start debugging. I prefer start without debugging. I'll show you the difference in a minute. I'm going to click start without debugging. And Visual Studio is actually going to compile all of the C# code. So it's building the project. It is a bit slow to compile. And you'll notice it's compiling if I go to the output tab. So it says it started the web server and it's running either with plain HTTP on this port or with HTTPS on a port that starts with 4437. So what does this compilation actually look like? So I'm going to go to my project and I'm just going to open up the directory on Windows. So if I open my folder in File Explorer, here's my solution file, and then I have a subfolder with my project name. So here's all the files, but there's a new folder here, a folder called bin. And the bin inside the debug folder, in here, I have a web application 1 DLL, or dynamic link library. So the DLL, that contains all the compiled C# code. So when we build the solution or change it and rebuild, it will generate a new DLL file. And when I click start debugging, I actually get a working web application. So I have a nav bar with 2 links. When I click privacy, it loads this view. When I click home, it loads this one. I have register and login links that probably aren't going to work for us yet. Oh, they actually do. So we can create an account. This won't work quite yet because we haven't configured our database. We've got a built-in login page. And we also have hooks to set up third-party authentication. So if we want Google, Facebook, Microsoft login, we can configure those. Our site is also mobile responsive. So if I scale this down, we get our little Bootstraps mobile responsive hamburger menu. So we have not done anything. I haven't changed the project in any way. All I did was create a base project. So we want to look a little bit at how these links work. Okay. So again, we can see from the URL, we said the first part of the URL refers to a controller, and the second part refers to a method or action in that controller. So what actually happens here when I click the link to home privacy? Well, in our home controller, we have a method called privacy, and it returns a view. Now notice here, both of these methods, index and privacy, they have the exact same code. So how do you suppose it knows when I click home? How does it know to load this view? And yet when I click privacy, it loads this view. Because we're not actually specifying which view to load. So you can either put an answer in the chat or feel free to turn on your mic and maybe make a suggestion how this is working. So these 2 links are active. These 2 methods both call views, but they load different views. How do we know? Yeah, it is based on the URL, Leo, you're right. But since the index method returns a view and the privacy method returns a view, how do we know which view to load? Clue is in here if you look at Solution Explorer. You're right, it does. It's actually based on the name of the view. So the method name automatically looks for a view with that same file name. So for example, if I rename this file, let's say I rename it to privacy policy. And now my method name is privacy, but the actual view is privacy policy. Let's see what happens now. It's frozen on me. I'm going to go back to the home page and try the privacy link again. We have to try it in a different browser. Let me just pull up Chrome. Okay, so now when I click privacy, notice because I no longer have a view called privacy, I get a view not found. So it can't load a view. So the default is that the method will always load a view with the exact same name. So if I rename this back to privacy, my link will work again. So now if I make the request again, it should load the view. So our method name should always have a matching view file of the same name. And also inside of the subfolder that's named after the controller. If our URL is using home, our view has to be inside the subfolder of views, also called home. Let's try adding a new method. A new view. So in the home controller, let's make a new method. It's going to return an iAction result. So this is typically a view, although it could be JSON, it could be an error, but this is the typical return type for controller methods. So let's make a new view called about. And we just want this view to also load a new page. So notice, right now I get an error because my view doesn't return anything. One important thing to note about the naming conventions in ASP.NET is Microsoft uses Pascal case. So if I name my method, start it with a lowercase a, Visual Studio will say, I violated the naming convention, that my method names must start with a capital. I want to return view. So if we run this code right now, we're going to get the same error. There's no view file called about. So we can create one in one of two ways. We could either go here and I could right click home and choose add a view. And I just have to be sure to name it about, or even simpler, if I right click my method name and choose add view from here, that way I can be sure, I'll just pick an empty view, the name will match for sure. So I don't even have to give it a name. Sorry, I guess I do. So we want a razor view empty that I will call about. And then we can add some HTML here. So now we want to try the URL localhost/home/about and see what happens. The URLs are also not case sensitive in IIS, which is great. Doesn't matter whether I use a capital A or a lowercase a. So let's see what happens when we try and load our about page. And I am mindful of the time. We won't be too much longer because I know a lot of you have class at 4 o'clock. We'll try and load home about and see what happens. Okay, so it says it can't find our view. Let's see what's happened. Oops, my file wasn't created in the right place. It's up here in controllers. I'll move it down into, it should be under views and home. And now our page loads. Okay. What if we want to add a simple link to it in the navigation bar? Our navigation bar exists in our layout. Right here on lines 22 to 27, these are our home and privacy links. Now we can use regular HTML links, or we can use these server-side directives. So I'm going to use one of those instead. So I'm going to add in a new list item. I'll add in a new link. I'll give it the same class as the other ones. Now I could use href, but what I'm going to use instead, just because it's more explicit that we're using MVC, is the controller and the action. So rather than linking to a specific URL, which we can do, we're going to be very intentional that we are calling a method of an MVC controller. So we're going to call the home controller, and in there we're going to call the about method. So I've added a third link. If I wanted to just write this as href equals /home/about, no problem. That link is good. That's going to work fine. So now if I go and reload my home, now we've got about here, and it loads our new page. Okay. So as long as we follow the convention, then we can add new pages this way. Okay. We're just going to make one more small change to this, and then we will call it a day. Okay. Want to look at a simple way. We have a couple of ways of passing data from the controller to the view. So we do this all the time. We've got data usually from our database, but sometimes it's even just a simple message, like we want to show an error message, or we want to show, you know, a statistic to a user that we've calculated in the controller, and we want to pass it and display it in the view. So there's a really simple object we can use called the view bag. This is for when we just have simple untyped data. So I'm going to go back to my controller, and in here, before we return the view, we're going to use this object called the view bag. It's just an empty container where we can define any kind of variable. It's not strongly typed. We'll say, this is a message from the controller. By putting this variable into this view bag object, we have access to it in the view so we can display it. So I'm going to save that change, and then I want to output this message in our about view in the content. So it's kind of a quick and dirty way of passing some simple content, simple data from the controller to the view. So I'll go back to about. And in here, let's see, I'll put in a div class equals. In here, we can just type the @ symbol and then use our view bag. So this should print this string variable that we've set up in our controller. It should print this text in an alert here. So I'll just refresh the page. Now, when we're passing more complicated data, we won't use the view bag, but simple messages or simple values. So now here's our alert, and the value that we pass, the value that we put right into the view bag in our controller, we can now render and display in the view. So we will use some other methods of passing data when we've got complex objects, but we will use the view bag for things like messages or simple data. Okay. So this is quite a different way of structuring our web applications and putting them together from the way we did it in PHP, where we did everything manually and all our logic, our data, and our presentation were kind of mashed together. So we've got this very organized, very well-structured architecture and pattern where the URLs are handed to a controller. The controller methods then render the views and can pass them data. And then the views are mostly HTML with a little bit of server-side code or a few of these extra kind of ASP additional tags and add-ons that are interpreted. But you can see how quickly and easily we can get things running. You know, if I want to change the footer in my web application, I can go down here and say, you know, first COMP2084 site. And if I save that in my footer, then my footer should change on all my pages. This web application 1 should get modified. So it says first COMP2084 site on all my pages. Pardon me. So you can see how quickly and easily how Microsoft makes things easy for us. And you might say, well, wow, this is so much easier. Why didn't we do this last semester? Would have saved us all this work. The idea is with PHP, we do things manually. So we learn how web applications are put together. We go through the pain of doing all the work manually. And then once we understand what we're doing, we can move to a more powerful tool like Visual Studio that will automate a lot of these tasks and save us time and effort. Okay, 3:59. Any questions for those of you who have to leave? By all means, I will stick around for a few minutes. Anybody have any questions about anything that we've done today? If so, feel free to throw them in the chat or turn on your microphone and ask. Okay, thanks, Nick. So just a reminder, yep, the quiz will be due. I'll make it available now, Brody, and you have until 5 o'clock. You have until 5 o'clock next Monday. And if you don't have everything installed, then please install everything you're going to need for next class. Okay, thanks, Zach. Okay, have a great week, everybody. Good to reconnect with all of you again. Have a good physics class, and I'll see you guys next week.